Okay, hello.
Well, good morning. You're listening to WXOX 97.1 FM in Louisville, Kentucky, or streaming on artxfm.com. This is LVA's Artebella on the radio, the show produced by Louisville Visual Art. I'm your host, Keith Waits. I have three artists here today. Let me run through my introductions. Joyce Barbour is a trans feminine multimedia artist focusing primarily on sound and installation. Conceptually, Barbour's work often explores the therapeutic possibilities of art and the idea of creativity as a communal effort. Collaboration is a strong part of her creative practice. Explore Barbour's music and sound art project further at Psychic Skin Bandcamp page, and there's more video work if you go to the Small Family Vimeo page, excuse me. And also with us today is Alexis Kite, a Louisville artist in the mediums of music, cartooning, and being an art hoe. And we'll ask for that definition later. More specifically, her main work in the ongoing diary comic is Life. She was the guitarist for the trans radical punk band Bathroom Laws and will eventually reestablish her current music project, Sildra. Lexi is also known for being a bimbo and loving 80s era video gaming. And finally, Vidalia Unwin is an actress and playwright who studied creative writing at the University of Louisville and studied theater unofficially at Bellarmine University. Her full-length credits for playwriting include Domesticate, Punk Snot, Broken Iris, and The Ballad of Night Moose, co-written by Lex Mitchell. Her short plays include Cruise Control, Hunting for Jackalopes, and Hiding on Jupiter. She has worked with several Louisville theater companies, including Derby City Playwrights and Looking for Lilith Theater Company. So thank all three of you for being with me.
Thanks for having us.
And Alexis, I'm going to do you the courtesy of asking you first, because I have some familiarity with Vidalia and Joyce in the past, but talk to me about you as an artist, what kind of work you do as an artist.
Well, okay. I mean, I think my two main stock in trades are like music and comics, which I've been doing both like basically since my teenage years. And my main thing is the diary comic is Life, which my goal for that was kind of just like, I've been doing diary comics my entire life, basically, and trying to, get it all into a uniform thing. And that finally happened. And I also wanted to have it be a bit of a vehicle to just like humanize my experience. Cause I think a lot of times when I see like comics about transness or from trans people, it's a very explicitly like, this is a trans thing, and it sometimes feels a little preachy to the choir. So for me, I'm just like, no, this is just my life, and it is gaudy and sloppy and wonderful. But yeah, and then with music, I just follow my muse wherever it takes me, or somebody is like, wow, she plays guitar weird, she should be in my band.
All right, well, thank you. We'll go around the horn here and get everybody on. Joyce, talk to us about your latest endeavors.
So recently, I think I've been more focused on music just because doing installation work is quite difficult because you need a forum, you need a physical space, brick and mortar, which is hard to come by in COVID times. So I'm kind of splitting my time between like music, a little bit of like illustration and like physical creation and like education. But yeah, my current thing I'm working on is a trans meditation tape, transgender, not transcendental meditation. Basically everyone on it is trans. I do the music. I have a couple of folks that I am familiar with, Kelly Weaver and Riley Short, doing readings. And all of the meditations are created with trans people in mind, but it is still beneficial to cisgender people. That is kind of where I'm at right now as far as what I'm working on. Yeah.
You're also, I know you are a teacher.
Yes. So, pre-COVID and especially post-COVID, I provide art instruction in various capacities. A lot of times I work with different organizations, nonprofits, and I've been doing some stuff with Preston Arts Center as well. Just kind of a variety of things, mostly very like 2D centric work. illustration, like collage, relief, and all that, and painting. I teach from like elementary school to adults, so I'm kind of across the board. And before COVID, I worked with the disability community of Louisville in an art studio specifically for adults with varying disabilities.
Right. Okay. Well, and finally, last but not least, Vidalia, where are you? You are an actor and a playwright, actress and a playwright. But so where? And I'm just to tell you what I know. You had a play that had a play reading just this past summer. So through the Johnson City Playwrights, where are you right now? What's going on right now?
Most recently, I had a short film that I got to shoot, write and direct with Claire Hagan for Looking for Lilith Productions. As part of a piece they were doing called Common Threads. It was a lot of different COVID stories of various types. And that just ended its run. Other than that, honestly, I'm in a downtime and I'm kind of enjoying it. I don't know, I'm dabbling a bit in doing sort of performance comedy. I'll be doing a little bit of that coming up. But as far as big theatrical, deep writing things, I'm in a proto mood where I'm just looking for ideas right now.
Okay, great. So what's interesting is that, when I wanted to talk to artists who are trans individuals, it's interesting that one of the things I kind of understood, at least just from the first people, you three and some other people I was checking out, was it seems like all the trans artists I was finding were doing so many kinds of things. And I don't know if that has, do you think, since you're on the microphone, is there any kind of relationship, do you think, in that, like that? I think all artists are curious about getting into different kinds of things, but there was no sort of just like trans landscape painter. All of you do different things and cross streams into different disciplines, it seems like.
As far as trans artists go, I don't know that there's a correlation. I personally know a lot of just very boring trans people, lovely, but they're very boring and they don't do much of anything. But I will gladly take the stereotype that yes, we're multi-talented, multi-hyphenate type folk. Please spread that. Tell your children.
Well, I guess I was just wondering, and there's so much I don't understand about the experience, but like, what is the relationship in if being in transition somehow is opening your mind to different kinds of things, or is it's a very individual experience. I wondered if that would influence your sensibility as an artist.
I can't entirely say, because they're not necessarily linked. So much of art is about pulling out the things that you yourself are interested in, right? And so for many artists, there are multiple either disciplines or concepts or ideas that they really want to tool with or play with, or maybe that's just one thing, but they have 8 million types of things to say about it. Whereas the act of being trans is less intellectual than that. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of a manner of being. I don't know that the experience of it is inherently eye-opening. It's just, when I wake up and look terrible, I'm still trans, even if all I can say is weird moaning noises because I'm incoherent that morning. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, Joyce, let's come back over to you for a second. So V1's answered this question for me. Does anything about your work as an artist or a teacher change because of transition? And well, let's just start with that question.
Okay. I think, yes and no, because just the same way that I can't divorce myself from transness, like my art can't divorce itself from me. And it's very much informed by like my experience, who I am, and like, just like my kind of, like V said, interests and things. I don't approach work in a different way, but the work, even if it's not inherently about transness, I think has maybe the content has shifted some. I think you were kind of saying something earlier about, trans folks being very multi-talented and not sticking to one thing. I would like to posit that maybe, depending on the trans person, because that's just a giant umbrella, that oftentimes we are people without boundaries, or like, you know, like as far as like we're outside the binary and we have to unlearn a lot of binary thinking, especially if you are like some form of like non-binary person. You inherently as a person don't choose not to play by the rules. So I think that kind of shows up in some trans people's work, and I would say mine as well. I like the experiment.
I like the way you put that. It made more sense. It made better sense of the thought that I had in my head. So thank you. Alexis, what has it been like for you? What has your work changed at all, or was your identity always just a part of your work?
I would say probably more the latter. I mean, wait, kind of. Like I've always been somebody who like tries on too many hats, so to speak. Like I've always been working in like unsuccessfully in multiple fields of art because just always appealed to me. And sometimes I was just like, wow, if I'm not ultimately super good at one thing, how about I'm kind of good at like 7 things or something? And as far as like the way my identity plays into it, like for me in a personal way, I mean, being trans like does put me at this thing where sometimes for other people it's like, oh, so mystical, so esoteric, look at you, I have to know. And I'm like, there ain't much to know in here. No. Ain't too bright. And as far as like yeah, the tone of my work probably changed, but I would almost attribute that more to age because, you know, I used to be so creative all over the place, everything all the time. And now I've just kind of like slowed down and I'm willing to like put a little bit more effort into things. But I think that's just kind of like looking at my life and being a like elder millennial bimbo and being like, you know what, I need a little bit more, I need to rein things in. But I don't know, I don't really think my transness has played into it too much, except for I'm less of a jerk than I used to be. I can still be a huge mean person, but I'm less mean sometimes.
What sort of underscores, of course, one of the things, and I think everybody gets this, but transition does not happen. It's not a light switch. This is something that happens over a period of months or years, or, you know, I don't know. This is why I run into my ignorance about the subject, that it's not something that happens easily or quickly, and that while you're going through this process, these are years going by, like you say, it's just years where you're also just maturing, which you would be anyway, so that your art has changed more just because of the stretch of time that you've been going through things.
Mhm.
Well, like Alexa, let's stay with you for a second. I want to be careful that I'm not like trying too hard to pry into personal experiences or traumas or whatever, but what was your experience in this, when you sort of started going through transition, in terms of how people accepted you or didn't accept you? Like how much difficulty was there for you personally?
Well, basically after I stopped hanging out at the tap room, my life got better. Like too many questions, too many bad decisions. So could you like ask me the question again? I forgot.
Well, and I'm probably like making it too complicated.
Acceptance, right?
How much acceptance has there been for you once you were in transition? And I think, if I understand correctly from previous conversations I've had, somebody can be in transition for quite a while before they have a gender expression, before something changes about their appearance to people or whatever. So I guess there comes a point where your transition becomes public or something that you are expressing to people. And so at that point, were you dealing with did you have acceptance? Did you have a lot of challenges or difficulties then?
I would say the earlier era of me transitioning, I mean, a bit so, but I'd say in ensuing years, it's also been perhaps a little bit like cool and expected of people to mostly like not be dumb and terrible about trans stuff. So it's definitely gotten like on the level better for me, but I also have like a fair amount of like passing privilege and I love to flirt with people. So that also like gives me like the benefit of like, oh well, hello. But yeah, I mean mostly things have been fine in my personal space as far as acceptance goes. I mean, sometimes I'm even critical of like feeling like I get special treatment or I'm like handled with gloves. And I'm just like, baby, I'm just a person. I'm a bubbly person and I am who I am, but yeah, too much eggshell walking. And I'm just like aware of it. I hear the eggshells. You don't need to step over them. You could also just sweep them away.
Well, V, talk to me about your experience a little bit.
But as far as acceptance goes,
Yeah, going back to the and again, I think if I'm using any kind of bad terminology, please feel free to correct me. But that's sort of
we'll cancel you instantly on Twitter. It's fine.
well,
We have the power.
I knew I could count on you, V. But the sort of when gender expression starts to change and you change your name and all these kinds of things where you're it almost seems like you're inviting people to be a part of the process just to see you or accept you differently. What was it like what was it like in that period for you?
It was kind of like it being in the trenches of it was sort of a blur as being in trenches really is. You know, I was so preoccupied with trying to figure out who I am, who I can be, how to be the person that I always wanted to be. You know, there's so much of that. And I was very, very lucky. I feel like I've always been very good at picking my correct chosen family, picking a good one. And that chosen family has largely been the theater and comedy communities and to some degree the punk communities in town. And they were instantly, and I mean instantly, accepting to the point where I really only had to like show up to 2 places as myself and let the rumor mill do the rest for me. And it was fine. However, you know, when you go outside of chosen family stuff, like, you know, it's been 4 years and I still have, you know, my parents are still struggling with it very difficultly. So to answer your question, I was very lucky that I had the acceptance that I had, and I did have great acceptance, but the feel of it at the time was so selfishly preoccupied, and it should have been, that I couldn't even recognize what it felt like at the time.
Well, but you're also referencing something I was wanting to get into more explicitly, which is, has it been easier because you're an artist? You seem to be saying yes, because you did have this chosen family, this theater community, the comedy community, and I'm familiar with a lot of the people that you're talking about in that community, and that there was a lot of acceptance there. So, and it's not that it's not, you know, I don't know if it's ever easy, but you sounds like you're saying yes, there was more acceptance because you were in a creative community. Yes,
the creative types do tend to yield more to that, so let's go with yes.
Yeah,
I could have also just been lucky.
Well, and Joyce, have you found that to be the case for you, that you were already existing in communities that were more acceptance, or did you ever have any kind of blowback?
For the most part, yes, there was acceptance. Like my transition was a bit more gradual. Like, I mean, it's forever for everyone, but you know, for a while, and still to some extent, I was gender neutral. So I was using gender neutral pronouns like they, them. And, you know, people struggled with that. And it seemed like I don't want to make any big claims about the general transness, but like it wasn't taken as seriously as when I shifted to more feminine pronouns and changed my name and used the word trans for the first time. But for the most part, there's been some moments where even like in experimental or progressive art spaces, people give me weird looks. Like the first time I wore a dress out, like there's a musician friend of mine who gave me like a double take. But other than that, you know, as V said, I very much curate the people I hang out with and the spaces I go to. As a person with anxiety, I tend to do that naturally anyway. So, you know, it's a lot better than going to like AutoZone or something.
It can be rough out there in gym pop.
Sure can.
And pop, yes. It reminds me though, I remember, I think this is so long ago, it may be the first time I can remember meeting a trans person. And it was somebody who was I went to a party with some that was the home of somebody who was a firefighter. And so there were a bunch of firefighters there. Well, one of the firefighters was if I understood correctly, the person had been a firefighter for quite some time, but was now in transition and was pretty far along. And I remember thinking, it kind of blew my mind because I thought, well, if you were going to ask me how this would have gone over in something like the environment of male firefighters, I would have thought it would have been a disaster. And but there's also, I know that in that population, right, those people that do that job are like, everybody I work with might be saving my life someday, right? There's that sort of almost military-like bonding. And so for them, they were like perfectly fine with it, or at least they worked to be fine with it. And it was nice. I thought it was refreshing to me, but again, it sort of blew what my bias was about how I thought the firefighters would respond in that situation. And they actually were incredibly supportive, closed ranks, like they're one of us no matter what. So do you so let me ask you this as and Joyce, let's stay with you on this. When we talk about general population, do you feel, and we've all kind of made it clear that by and large, you all exist within communities of choice, families of choice that have been more accepting. Do you see evidence that in the general population, I'm sure there's lots of resistance, but is it softened? Is it getting better? Is there more acceptance happening in the general population than you thought there was 10 years ago?
That's a loaded question for sure. I think I feel like it's hard for me to answer because I very much live in a bubble. I'm somewhat ashamed of that, but not. You know, my safety is important to me and my mental health is important to me. So that's a part of why I've created such a big, you know, kind of a stern bubble. You know, I think transness is being talked about more. And I think more people recognize it's a thing, you know, for better and worse. I think it's more of a thing. Like, you know, I recently got home from a trip and I was like in Seattle and Portland. And I didn't go into a lot of physical spaces because of COVID, but like I kind of always consciously, when I go into a building, see like if they have gender neutral bathrooms or they have a gender neutral option or like what, you know, kind of the vibe. So you are seeing more spaces like that here and there, like people recognizing and making some accommodations or whatever you want to call them. I don't know. I don't think I have the capacity to answer that question. I know that transness is being talked about more, and I think with more kind of visibility and more like conversations about it, it is helping.
Sure. So Alexis, what are your thoughts on that?
I would say, I don't know, in my experience, probably it does seem like in the general world, certainly more awareness, generally more positivity, but also still just like broad misunderstanding and jumping to conclusions, having expectancies and things that, you know, can still kind of just feel like, wow, that's a little bit reductive just to like put on my existence. But I would say it's at least going generally in a better direction. I mean, I've been privy to talk to like some like older trans people and stuff, like people that were like within a few years ago, like in their like 70s and 60s and stuff, and hearing stories about the climate of culture in the like 80s compared to now. And I'm like, okay, well, that really sucks for you. I'm sorry. And I think generally things are going in the right direction. It would be super cool if it hit a point where it's no longer a thing, you know?
Mhm.
It's always a thing. And sometimes I'm just like, I just want to be the basic bee who's just like, cool, I just am. And I think people will eventually get there. And their current thing, they're doing cromulent, perfectly cromulent. But you know, there's always room to be perfecter. So get on it, cis people.
Well, and V, just to finish out the thoughts, what's your view on that?
So, I mean, absolutely, there is more acceptance and it is easier. With that said, you look at the numbers of, let's say, the bad news, and they are not good numbers, and they should not be ignored. And especially if you are trans, they are something you should keep at the very least in the back of your mind, if not in the forefront of your mind, depending on situations. However, with the amount of passive knowledge and understanding, that has ballooned to the point where you've got a lot more genuine allies. You've got a lot more, you know, the people that are like, oh, I don't have a problem with it, but you know, that sort of mid-level thing. You do also have a weird backlash of people that were gonna hate a trans person anyway, and now hate them a little more because they're getting attention. But like one anecdotal thing that I do think is interesting is I remember being, you know, still very early, you know, in transition, very early, and you know, it might have been the first time I was in a grocery store presenting, I think. When you're in that phase, you're very hyper aware of people looking at you. So take all this with a grain of salt. But there was one couple I noticed amongst the many glares that like they pass the aisle I'm in and they stop and they turn and they look at me and then they have to walk away. And when I realized what it was, is not necessarily that they were negatively judgmental. What it is that at that time, this is only 4 or 5 years ago, they had not probably met or seen very many trans people. They couldn't ignore me the way that they might be able to ignore, let's say, a tree. Because you've seen every freaking tree that ever lived. You don't even you just move on. You don't even look at it. And I was not that. And I never get that kind of reaction anymore, right? That sort of anecdotal, like, oh, they're real. Like that doesn't happen. And I think honestly is a very big step in some direction.
Well, yeah, it's many steps. I was going back to Joyce, the thing you said a little while ago. I think about what sort of goes to the question of artistic identity. When you were talking about how you made reference to like you're never not done, like your transition continues. Maybe is it the rest of your life, or is there ever a point where you have reached a certain finish line for it, where you feel sort of completely there?
That can depend on the person, honestly. I've heard
Sorry.
of. Oh, sorry, you're fine.
Oh,
I've heard of primarily women, a handful of trans men as well, that do kind of feel like they reached the promised land, and they're done, and they no longer consider themselves trans, and that's its own discussion point that I have no right to get into. But for the vast majority of us, there's going to be ever lingering psychological issues to deal with. There's going to be an ever lingering battle with as Lexi said, passing privilege, and the forever ghosts of the people that knew you before. And so even if you get all these things, you know, medically and cosmetically and whatever else to, let's say, complete the transition, for most of us, there's always going to be this lingering seed. And so it's never really finished for a lot of people.
Yeah, you know, what I was going to say is everyone's narrative is different. You know, not everyone's narrative is what the mainstream media sells you. It's like, oh, you get on HRT, you do all the surgeries, you do this and that, etc. You know, everyone goes about it differently. Like some people do say, this was my before life, this is my now life. Like I like to think of it more as an evolution and just me maturing and becoming more my own. You know, I have always kind of felt different. And I always just attribute it to like, oh, I'm an artsy type, like, ooh, I'm creative. Oh, I'm just like punk. And that's why these people are staring at me. But, you know, like as you age, you kind of, you know, or as I aged, I kind of realized like what those things really were. Yes, some of it was being a creative person, but also like part of being a creative person is like kind of entwined with my transness, like being creative with like my identity. And like I've never been someone who likes to just like be stuck in one little box. But yeah, now I understand with like age and therapy, you know, it's transness. But you know, that's just like one of many labels you could kind of put on it. But yeah, mine's more of an evolution. But yeah, I think just like how, like for instance, like people that are on spectrums of things, if you've met one trans person, you've only met one trans person. Their story is completely different from anyone else's in the way they think about it.
But it also seems like what I'm picking in this the previous conversation I had with V really sort of reminded me of this, that this was always a part of who you were. I'm understanding, but your degree of awareness about that maybe comes later in different times for different people. So that when I ask the question about artistic identity, even before you ever thought the word trans applied to you, that's just who you were and that's your sensibility, and so your artistic identity was hopefully just a pure expression of yourself.
I like to think so.
Yeah, same. You know, I didn't have access to the internet until like later in life, like college, and even then it wasn't as omnipresent. So I didn't even understand that transness was an option. You know, there were obviously times where my teenage brain was like, oh, I wish I was a woman or whatever. But like, I didn't understand like, oh, that's a possibility. You know, so with experience and knowledge, it was like, oh, okay, there are people out there that are more like me.
I tried to investigate transness and stuff on the early internet of like the late 90s, early 2000s. Oh, whoa, no. It was a bunch of resources that, one, I was too dumb to understand, still too dumb to understand, and two, numbers are fun, just made me feel terrible. I am stoked for the younger generations that have like much more in the sense of like resources and communities available to them, because it was depressing as hell in the late 90s being like teenage unsure trans person. It was awful. There was no Reddit. But it's really cool for the younger people because it's like, get it, advance the field and stuff.
I was very lucky that Eddie Izzard came out with her Dress to Kill stand-up special in '98 or so, which was just when I was starting to get what I now recognize are the trans feels. But it's everyone said it was the mid '90s, late '90s. internet exists, but you don't even, it would never would have occurred to me for another 10 years to even try and look something up online. And there's no awareness, there's no understanding, there's not even a term for it. And so out comes this person who, you know, at the time identified as a man who just liked wearing women's clothes, and male lesbian, male tomboy was how she would describe it at the time. And that lifted so much trauma off of me. And I was very lucky to have that because most people didn't. And it fit my definition. But I honestly, if I hadn't had that, God knows where I would have wound up.
Well, let's
now.
well, let me ask you that. Let me ask you this question too. That sort of brings me into when you talk about sort of having that sort of example be available to you. You guys all talked about your work in terms that it doesn't necessarily represent or address transition. It's sort of you know, it's just your work, and it has to do with a whole lot of different kinds of things, and there's obviously a relationship to it. Do you ever feel, and that's not exactly true, I know all three of you don't do exactly the same thing, but do you ever feel a responsibility in your work as an artist to try to maybe not do exactly what Eddie Izzard did for Vidalia, but to sort of keep pushing the envelope and raising levels of understanding in what you do as an artist? Or do you feel like that pigeonholes you now if you do that? And Joyce, let's start with you.
Okay. Okay. I'll try to, I know I'm long-winded, so I'll try to keep it short. But to a degree, there is that pressure, you know, like I do believe that representation and being present and being an example is a good thing. You know, I do a lot of work through education, but also like to some degree, I'm on the board for Girls Rock Louisville. So to some degree, like there too. What was that?
I love them.
They're great. You know, so to a degree, like I understand the importance and the impact that can make, you know. I would say like, yeah, there is a pressure to do that with work. But I think more so it's more present in like what I do in my instructional work and education instead of my personal art practice. Just because, you know, I think someone had said it, the younger generation is more informed and they have these communities, and like, obviously I am still looking at a very small population, but I am seeing like more just like disregard for labels and things like in regards to gender, identity, orientation, etc. in the classroom. And there's a lot of like students that I know that are like trans or some kind of gender expansive, you know, non-binary, whatever, but their families at home may not know. So, you know, I think as my job as a teacher is like, I'm supposed to give them a safe space to where they can learn. And a part of that is making them feel trusted and respected in the ways that they want to be. So I try to provide that space so they can just focus on work. And a part of that is being like, I'm going to use your chosen name. I'm going to use your chosen pronouns. Like, we'll work it out so you are comfortable, you are respected, and you can just learn and do the art. But yeah, I think more so in like that realm that I kind of feel that need to do that, just because like care about my students, and that's the job of the teacher.
Well, and Alexis, put that question to you because, and actually, I was thinking about that when I said your work, all of your work doesn't, but you were talking about how some of your, I think particularly the comics, did sort of were a part of you, your trans identity or an expression of that. Was that the case?
Well, I've always done diary comics.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think once I like found myself, so to speak, it became like a more firm thing I was doing. But I'm also like, I'm more typically the person to like lift a quote from Robert Pollard I'm not a role model. I'm an entertainer. Like, I do poetry, I do art, I have my bimbo philosophies and stuff, but I generally don't really I don't put too much pressure on myself to like have my work explain myself or explain transness. I'd like to just let it be and let people have their own conclusions. I mean, while I was in bathroom wise, a lot of our stuff and our actions were, very politically motivated or had like this like goal to like have some kind of effect, to express something about transness, to make cis people uncomfortable in addressing their own like assumptions and preoccupations, prejudices they may have.
Mhm.
But I typically go for more loosey-goosey fun. And I'm just like, you know what? There's enough people out there being serious. I can also just be like the person who's just like, well, here's some comics about a bad hookup I had. And then I'm fine with that for the most part. I don't think I need to exert myself too much to explain something that so many other people are.
Yeah. Well, I would just make the point that even if you're not intentionally a role model, the kind of attitude you're talking about, I think kind of makes you a de facto role model.
Oh, I know. It sucks. I hate it. And I'm just like, I'm telling people, it's just like, well, honey, if you actually listen to the things I say, you would just be like, people like what I do. They don't like me. It's fine. Then you don't want to end up like me.
Well, and coming back to V, and I bet V, I wonder what Eddie Izzard have thought of himself as a role model when he at the beginning of his career. I think it would be hard for him to deny it now, but but when you talk about those early specials that people saw, he just probably saw himself as an entertainer. V, what about you? And you also have, and I think as a playwright, you have the opportunity to tell stories and to tell specific kinds of stories and create things. I mean, I don't know, theater is such a storytelling form, and all of these are. But how do you feel about that question? Like, do you feel an additional responsibility, or do you feel like that really doesn't apply to your work?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Kurt Vonnegut for 2 minutes, and by the end of it, I will be answering your question. So, almost every single Kurt Vonnegut novel discusses, to some degree or another, the firebombing of Dresden, which was an actual, horrific mass death that happened during World War II, of which he survived while being a prisoner of war in a camp in Germany. Most specifically, he deals with it in Slaughterhouse-Five, but there is so much discussion on how difficult it has been for him to write about this. And the book itself actually is almost not at all about this moment. But he talks about how he wrote about it and kept writing about it. None of it was good, and kept having these ideas of what is there to really say about a tragedy? And the fact that he keeps popping up and in different works, and that work in particular is very much about the PTSD and trying to figure out how to process these things. And I think that the reason, it's because it's too big. It's too big and it contains too much, and he's too close to it and he's unable to discuss it. So with that said, I think it's interesting that everything I wrote before coming out included a trans character, and nothing I've written after coming out includes a trans character. And I think it's because it was too subconscious. I was far enough away to kind of be aware of it. And then I'm just too close to it. And especially with how I write theater and stage, I if it's a full play, I'm always wanting to say some pretentious thing or another about some topic that I hope will last beyond a 10-year regimen and will have a unique take. And, and it's things that I can talk about transness in the year 20 whatever. And maybe I can even make a compelling story, but it's going to be so dated and so stuck in its moment. And I want to, discuss something bigger than that. And so it doesn't wind up in there. Where it does end up lately is in a lot of the sort of comedy things I'm doing, because I consider them more, maybe bubblegum's the right word. It's just sort of immediate. You throw it away when you're done kind of thing. Not that it's, worse or unpleasurable, but I'm able to just microprocess the little bits. when doing it that way, as opposed to trying to tackle the big thing that I'm too close to and that I can't wrap my head around the full scope of it.
Well, there's a long tradition in comedy of using comedy to laugh at things that are uncomfortable or challenging or frighten us or whatever. And so I would think that would, in some ways, that could be a perfect place for an expression like that. And again, going to like where it might do the most good, in terms of like bringing that to an audience. Well, I think it's time to wrap it up. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I want to thank all three of you. I'm going to say your names again. Vidalia Unwin, actress and playwright here in Louisville. Alexis Kite, a Louisville artist in the mediums of music, cartooning, and being an art hoe. And Joyce Barbour, trans feminine multimedia artist, focusing primarily on sound and installation. Thank you all for being here to have this conversation today. And I'm sure I will be talking to you about one thing or another here in the coming months.
Thanks for having us.
All right.